Albertans are still reeling from news that one of Canada's oldest and largest energy companies is moving its headquarters to the U.S. Encana CEO Doug Suttles says the move is necessary to attract more investment dollars. The Alberta government blames its federal counterpart for creating what it says is a poor investment climate in the energy sector with too many regulations and too few pipelines to Tidewater. So how is the federal government reacting? Amarjeet Sohi is a defeated Liberal MP from Alberta, but until Cabinet is sworn in, he's the sitting Minister of Natural Resources. Minister, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
We'll get into what's ahead for your future in a moment, but I do have to start with something that's developed over the past couple of days, an urgent situation in Alberta. Did you or the government get any heads up that Encana was preparing to shift its focus to the United States and rebrand itself?
Well, obviously we are disappointed, the decision made by the company, but this is a decision that they were anticipating for a while and have been talking about their business model and going and moving in a certain direction. But good news is that their operations in Canada are not impacted. There are no impact on workers and the investments they will continue to make here in our country, but we're obviously disappointed.
But did you know this was coming? Did they give you any warning or any heads up?
Well, Minister Morneau has spoken with the CEO of the company today, and it was in the news before as well, right?
But before then, no heads up. They didn't reach out to say, "Hey, we're doing this." Heads up. No
well, this is not that something was not known. This was well talked about in the media as well, right? So,
is there something more your government could have done to stop this?
I think as we reflect on the results of the last election, this federal election, and understanding the deep-rooted frustration and anger that we saw in Alberta, particularly the workers impacted by the downturn, prolonged downturn in the energy sector. There are things that governments do not control. Like no government controls the price of oil, right, or gas. What we do control is how do we expand our markets. We have been working hard on that. As you know, the work I did on Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project, which is under construction now or moving forward on building Keystone XL, as well as the Enbridge Line 3, which is complete, and supporting our energy sector. We need to do more. Absolutely, we need to do more. But I'm very proud of the work that our government was able to accomplish. But I think we need to continue to respond to people's anxieties and make sure that they understand their federal government's there with them and supporting them.
Now, I suspect Alberta Premier Jason Kenney would disagree with your assessment of the track record of the Liberal government in this situation. And yesterday, in an interview with the Globe and Mail, he directly blamed the policies of your government for what happened with Encana. And the way it's being widely described by media and analysts in Alberta, they're describing it as a gut punch to the province, if not a gut punch to the Canadian economy at whole, even if it's just symbolic at this stage. How do you respond to that?
What I would say to Premier Kenney is that he has been in an office more than 6 months now, and his policies and the incentives or the tax breaks that he has given to wealthy, profitable corporations have not created a single job, right? So the issue is more structural. We need to work together and look at the root causes and understand that what we can do, that our natural resources sector, including our oil and gas sector, remain a source of well-paying middle-class jobs, and that we are supporting workers and communities. I think it does not help anyone to continue to point fingers at each other, right? I think we need to work together, and we need to work together to ensure that workers and communities that are being impacted are given the necessary support and they're given the hope for the future. Too many Albertans have lost their jobs over the last number of years, and we have a responsibility to ensure we work together to help and support them and continue to invest and overcome the challenges that our energy sector has faced over the last number of years. I can go back and point to a number of things that Harper government failed to do, and then with the work that we need to do together, I think we need to move beyond pointing fingers and playing politics with this, because Albertans deserve better from all of us.
Now, with respect, while you say that pointing fingers doesn't solve any problems here and doesn't create jobs, at the start of that answer, you did say that Jason Kenney's policies are not creating jobs for the sector. So is Jason Kenney to blame? Is the Premier of Alberta to blame for this?
I think what we need to look at, Katie, is what are the reasons that we have seen this prolonged downturn in the energy sector, right? And what levers that governments do have and what we do not have, and have that very honest discussion with each other. Because at the end of the day, people want good, well-paying jobs. And it's a responsibility of the government to ensure that we are growing our economy. At the same time, tackling other challenges, right? There are anxieties around climate change people are worried about. There are anxieties about when people talk about climate change, other people feel threatened by it because they feel their jobs are at risk, right? I think, how do we respond to all those things together? We need to find solutions and need to work together on those.
Given the level of frustration in Alberta and what was expressed to Ottawa in the federal election, with the vote that we saw. And given what happened with Encana, is this not something that Justin Trudeau, as Prime Minister himself, to try to ease some of those tensions and try to allay some of those concerns, should he not be out talking about Encana, talking about how he's going to try and help the energy industry? I know that you're the sitting minister, but there's going to be a cabinet shuffle after, or there's going to be some sort of new cabinet sworn in on November 20th. Does the Prime Minister himself not need to be getting out there and talking about this? Because this is one of those issues that is so deeply important to Albertans.
Prime Minister has spent more time in Alberta over the last 4 years, and meeting with the workers and visiting cities like Fort McMurray, Calgary, Edmonton, and visiting the site where the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is going to start construction, or going to start from, right? And obviously, right after the election, he said he's going to reflect on the result of this election and find ways to pull Canadians together and reduce this unnecessary, unwarranted polarization that is hurting all of us. And I am very confident that he's going to work hard and find solutions to this. And because of our history, when you look at yes, we faced a lot of criticism in Alberta on a number of things, but look at the work we have done. We have invested 8 times more in infrastructure in Alberta to help grow our economy. We are moving forward on 3 pipelines, including the hard work that I did on fixing a broken process on Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. Project is underway, under construction. I hope that people will stop questioning whether pipeline will get built or not, because it's being built, because it's then again creates uncertainty, which is harming our energy sector. Child poverty has been reduced in half in Alberta because of the Canada Child Benefit and our partnership with the province of Alberta. We doubled funding for economic diversification for Alberta. There's a number of other things that I can list. Yes, we need to do more, and I am confident that Prime Minister is going to find the way to ensure that we are responding to people's anxieties.
The last question I will ask about this sort of specific concern is, though, if the people, because the Prime Minister himself isn't out there getting in front of this, could it leave the impression with the people of Alberta that he doesn't care? Could it leave that impression?
He does care. Right, he does care, and I talked about a number of things that we have been able to do under his leadership, but we need to do more, and I am absolutely confident that Prime Minister is going to find ways to ensure that oil and gas and Alberta's energy sector is appreciated, that people who work in that sector are respected, and that we convey to them how valuable their contributions have been over the last number of decades to building stronger communities across the country, not just within Alberta, and acknowledging and appreciating and conveying that appreciation to Albertans is very, very important.
Are you providing the Prime Minister with any advice as to how you ensure that Western voices are represented in Cabinet, even though there aren't any MPs from Alberta or Saskatchewan as part of the Liberal team?
You know, I have spoken with Prime Minister a couple of times since the election.
What are you advising him to do?
You know, it's up to him to find the right voices and appropriate people to be reflective and including those voices in the government. I'm pretty sure he's going to find those voices, but that's a decision that Prime Minister gets to make. Katie, I have lived in Alberta for 35 years, right? Albertans are proud Canadians. Yes, they're angry. Yes, they're frustrated, and they want their federal government to do more. And our federal government, I am 100% confident, will do more. And at the same time, just making sure that we are there to listen and respond to those anxieties.
What's next for you?
I'm going to obviously take some time off. I've been in public service for 12 years. It has been an honor to serve the communities of Edmonton, and I feel lucky that someone who came to this country from somewhere else and had a very humble beginning was able to serve Canada in cabinet under Prime Minister Trudeau, and I will continue to find a way to give back. This country has given me and my family a lot, and we have an obligation to continue to give back in whichever way we can.
Minister Sohi, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You heard Minister Sohi mention a conversation between Finance Minister Bill Morneau and the CEO of Encana. Minister Morneau has tweeted about that conversation, writing in part, "This morning I spoke to Doug Suttles, the CEO of Encana, to express my disappointment in his company's decision to move their headquarters to the United States. He assured me that this decision would not have an impact on jobs in Canada or Encana's future investment decisions." So what does Ottawa need to do to reassure Albertans that their plight will be top of mind at the federal cabinet table? Jason Kenney is the Premier of Alberta, and he joins us from Calgary. Now, before we get to the developments with Encana, sir, I'd like to just start. A short time ago, you were on a conference call with Canada's premiers, and I suspect these kinds of issues did come up. Can you sort of walk us through what happened on that call?
Well, yes, I think that's why Premier Scott Moe, my Saskatchewan colleague who chairs the Council of the Federation, convened an extraordinary conference call today to canvass premiers on whether we should have a Council of the Federation meeting and seek a First Minister's meeting with the Prime Minister, given the results of the recent election. And there was a consensus that we should start by meeting amongst ourselves. They're looking for a date later this month. And there was also a consensus that we should identify a short and limited list on which we are in broad agreement to take to the federal government. Premier Legault suggested that should include the ability to develop our own resources and to push back against federal intrusion into our jurisdiction. That would be Bill C-69, a bill that 9 of 10 provinces and 2 of 3 territories oppose. So we'll wait and see if there's a meeting coming up this month and the next steps following from that. But I've placed a great emphasis on trying to anticipating the possibility of a second Trudeau government, trying to find allies amongst other provincial governments whose interests are aligned with ours here in the West.
Now, shifting, you say that this is an extraordinary conference call that you guys held this afternoon, all the premiers. Now, one issue that, of course, is top of mind in Alberta is Encana, and Encana CEO, who has since the decision announcing that they are going to shift their headquarters to the United States, they're rebranding, he has said publicly that he is adamant the political climate has nothing to do with the decision to move its headquarters and to rebrand. Is the CEO lying?
Well, I'm not going to use that verb, but I'll say his stated rationale for the move is to have greater access to American capital markets, to equity markets. And that, what does he mean by that? Well, essentially, the U.S. energy stocks have been significantly outperforming Canadian energy stocks at the same global prices. And this is why his predecessor, Gwyn Morgan, who founded Encana, said the following yesterday: the destructive policies of the Trudeau Liberals have left the company with no choice but to shift its asset base and capital programs south south of the border. Now its re-election strikes the final blow, quote unquote. You have to also look at this move in the context of tens of billions of dollars of capital shifting from the Canadian energy sector to the U.S. energy sector. Equipment, jobs, people, and now major companies who have shifted as well. So it's not a one-off, it's not a narrow decision, it's part of a broader trend, which is undermining our capacity to develop wealth, jobs, and government revenues here in Canada.
Is there something that your government could have done to stop this from happening with Encana?
I don't think so. We only learned about this the morning of the decision, and we're doing everything we can to make Alberta at least a more competitive place to attract and retain investment. For example, reducing the business tax rate by a third. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because Canada lost its competitive edge on the corporate tax front to the United States. I think we've been a little bit asleep at the switch. While we've had governments here in recent years increasing the tax burden on job creators, the United States has reduced by over a third their average business tax rate. And I think that's one of the reasons, we talk about Encana now, but we've seen hundreds of smaller companies move from Alberta to Texas, for example. We're not going to bring that capital and those jobs back unless we change our policies to be more competitive. That's why we are, for example, reducing both red tape and the business tax burden.
Now, you said in an interview with the Globe and Mail that this is not just about Encana, it's about the broader decline of the Canadian energy industry. And
Correct.
I'm going to quote something that you said, which I think is a deliberate policy of the Trudeau government. Now, why specifically say that when the Trudeau government bought a pipeline?
Well, they bought a pipeline after having killed two pipelines.
They didn't kill the pipelines. If you're talking about Energy East, they didn't kill that. That was a decision made because of regulatory, but I'll let you finish your answer.
Sure. They absolutely did kill Northern Gateway. They vetoed an approved pipeline that was ready to go to construction. Then they did kill Energy East by changing the regulatory parameters, forcing that company.
The company didn't say that, though. Energy East, the company didn't say that.
Actually, they did, and I'd be happy to point out exactly in their statement. I think it's August 23rd, 2017, where the CEO of TC Energy, then TransCanada, said that the new regulatory requirements being imposed by the National Energy Board at the behest of the federal government created significant uncertainty. That was the deciding factor. After they invested $1 billion, they walked away because TC Energy did not know how to comply with the imposition of up and downstream emissions as part of the regulatory oversight. In addition to that, the Trudeau government surrendered without a peep of protest to the Obama veto of Keystone XL. They bungled Trans Mountain to the point where the Kinder Morgan left Canada effectively, divested itself. They brought in the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69, which the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association says guarantees no more major pipelines will be proposed in the future. They imposed this prejudicial attack on Alberta energy exports through the Bill C-48 tanker ban. Prime Minister Trudeau himself said he wants to phase out the oil sands, and much of the senior political staff in their government worked for organizations in the past that were explicitly committed to landlocking Canadian energy. So yes, I do think that it is ultimately their intention to, as to quote the Prime Minister, phase out the oil sands.
So do you believe that it was completely meaningless for the federal government to purchase the Trans Mountain pipeline?
No, it's not meaningless, and we insist that get done. We certainly hope that the Trans Mountain project isn't thrown under the bus of a coalition deal to get support from the Bloc or the NDP on a confidence motion. I made that very clear to the Prime Minister Tuesday, the morning after the election when we spoke by phone. And by the way, I'm appreciative of the comments made by Premier Horgan in the Globe and Mail today, indicating that the BC government will continue to issue permits to facilitate that. And we are doing our part, by the way, to try to facilitate Aboriginal co-ownership or financial participation in that project and other major resource projects, which we think can be a game changer to get market access.
Do you think that taking this line of attack against the Trudeau Liberal government is only stoking those frustrations of people in Alberta, people in Saskatchewan as well? Is this line of attack against the Liberals stoking those sentiments of separatism in the West?
No, I think I'm reflecting the deep frustration that exists in most of the West, and certainly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, towards it. Let's just look at this a different way. Imagine if the federal government passed a law that would ban exports from some of our coasts of Quebec airplanes or Ontario automobiles. Imagine if they said that the Prime Minister in this last campaign said that we need, in French, he said, we need a Prime Minister who will stand up to Premier Kenney and les grands pétroliers, the big oil companies. Imagine if he stood up and said, we need a Prime Minister to stand up to the auto sector, or to the Quebec's aviation sector, or to Atlantic Canada's fishery sector. It would be unthinkable. So here we are, as one of the great engines of Canadian jobs, prosperity, and government revenues in recent decades, with the Prime Minister campaigning by putting a target on the back of our largest employers. That sort of summarizes the reasons for the frustration that exist here.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you a little bit about Conservative leader Andrew Scheer. Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay earlier this week described the Conservative Party's election performance under Andrew Scheer as, quote, like having a breakaway on an open net and missing. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, no. Andrew Scheer led the federal Conservatives to the largest vote total in the history of that party, to winning the popular vote, to gaining seats in every region, and to taking the Trudeau government down to a minority which most people thought in Canadian politics was at best improbable, if not impossible, 3 or 4 years ago. So I think real progress was made. Obviously, also mistakes were made. And I spoke to Andrew yesterday, and I know that he and the federal Conservatives will go through a serious retrospective lessons learned on the campaign. But I think it's the wrong approach when you don't win a campaign immediately to turn on the leader and go through a period of internal crisis. That is, Tory parties have done that in the past, and that's what kept them out of office often for so long. I think one sign of maturity of the federal Conservative Party would be to, yes, have an honest conversation about what mistakes were made, but to maintain stability and continue making progress.
From your perspective, what were the mistakes?
Oh, well, I suppose you could identify a lot of them. From my point of view, I think the focus should have been more on integrity and leadership than the cost of living. I always thought the Liberals would outbid a Conservative Party when it comes to issues like cost of living by just taking whatever we promised and adding more, because they don't care about the deficit or fiscal responsibility. So in my perspective, that might have been a mistake.
One last question. What do you think of Peter MacKay made a point of talking about Andrew Scheer's position on social issues, whether it be abortion or whether it be same-sex marriage. Do you see that as a problem?
No, essentially Andrew's position on those questions is the same as Stephen Harper's, who won 3 elections, including an historic majority. That is to say that people have a range of views in our pluralistic society, but that a Conservative government wouldn't change the law on those matters. So that Peter ran under the same policy 3 times, as did I, and we won 3 elections. So I don't think.
But have things not changed? It's 2019. Have things not changed? Have Canadians not moved past that? And they're looking particularly on the issue of same-sex marriage, given that there are parts of the world where that's not legal, and given the challenges around equal rights, is that not an issue where Canadians want to look up and see an ally, someone who's supporting that?
Well, in point of fact, the federal Conservative Party changed its policy formally in 2016 at our convention following the last campaign to remove the language about traditional definition of marriage. And actually, it was the last Conservative government under John Baird's leadership that prioritized the protection of the rights of sexual minorities overseas, and under my leadership at immigration created Canada's first ever designated refugee resettlement program for persecuted gay refugees to help them move to the safety of Canada. So I think Conservatives have a proud record on some of those issues.
Premier Kenney, I've already taken up too much of your time. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Is the Liberal federal government doing enough to help Alberta, or does it need to do much, much more? As you just heard, that depends on who you ask. So how deep is the rift between Alberta and the federal government, and what will it take to rectify? Time for the Power Panel in Calgary. Kelly Kreiderman of the Globe and Mail. In Winnipeg, Nigan St. Clair is Associate Professor at the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. He is also a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Marty Patrickin is the Quebec correspondent correspondent for The Logic. He's in Montreal. And here with me in studio is Le Devoir's Marie Vestel. Kelly, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of Minister Sohi's take that politicians need to stop pointing fingers, but at the same time, he stated that Kenney's policies haven't created any jobs in Alberta in the same answer?
I don't think the pointing of fingers is going to stop anytime soon. I think that's, a wish. But, I think it is a very fraught time. We had the announcement yesterday that Encana is going to leave Calgary as its head office, set up shop in the United States. And it's hard to describe what a shock to the system this is in Calgary to other parts of Canada. It is an iconic company for the oil patch. It's not necessarily a name that's known in central or eastern Canada as well, but it would be, someone said to me yesterday, what if Royal Bank announced they were packing up and moving to New York? It would be of that caliber, I guess, in terms of the oil patch. And I think there's still a disconnect there with the federal government. I think that the federal government reaction to this was muted yesterday. They expressed disappointment, but they also went on to point out the policies that they've enacted that would help this. But there is a major concern about not just a run-of-the-mill oil and gas company packing up and leaving, but a company that has roots going back to the 1880s in Canada. And I think until, and right now, and in this debate, of course, there is valid points and valid concerns about whether Jason Kenney's corporate tax cut, is actually going to keep anybody here. But at the same time, recognizing the seriousness of the situation to a lot of Albertans would go a long way for Ottawa not having fingers pointed at it.
Nigan, I want to ask you, we asked Amarjeet Sohi, should the Prime Minister himself not be out there talking about this, given that this is such an iconic company, given the tensions between Alberta and Ottawa at this stage? Does it send a message to Albertans that perhaps the Trudeau government, this re-elected government, isn't listening to the signals that Albertans sent to Ottawa?
Well, I think definitely it's a two-way street here. Alberta's been for a very long period of time been benefiting economically off the mere geographical location in which they live, and not only have Albertans benefited a great deal, but then they're ostracizing themselves from the other prairie provinces. We've seen with Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister, fellow Conservative, turning to Alberta and saying all this talk of separation is absolute nonsense. And there's a great deal of concern, I think, within the country itself over the situation of Alberta and Saskatchewan and the distance from the federal government. But generally, there's also a concern into a two-way street, a concern with the way Alberta's been acting. And so I think the outcome of this company leaving is really a way in which there's may not get a lot of sympathy from the rest of the country.
Speaking of sympathy, Marie, how is this news going over in Quebec? Is this on the radar the same way it is in different parts of the country?
Well, I'd say today there's not much on the radar other than
the storm.
Yeah, the storm and the massive people without electricity. Sorry. But Quebec has seen actually its share of companies also leave for the United States or be bought out by U.S. companies. And so I would think there would be a lot of sympathy and a sort of impression that this is sort of Groundhog Day. I think Premier Kenney did touch a point when he mentioned corporate tax rates. It has been brought up before, and perhaps he was almost countering his own argument that this is a political decision by Encana and that leaving because of Justin Trudeau's Liberal government's policies, because he did recognize it's also a question of money. And the CEO of the company, Mr. Suttles, saying what I read in the Globe this morning, that it's also there's a bigger cash pool in the U.S. and that's sort of why they're leaving, I think is also a factor that should be considered in this and perhaps should start a broader conversation about investment and where is the advantage and why are so many companies leaving for the U.S. Then to go back to your question of Mr. Sohi actually pointing fingers at Kenney by saying that Mr. Kenney is pointing fingers at others, it is a bit disappointing to see that in week one of this 2.0 Trudeau government, which is now a minority government and is promising to collaborate better with everybody, Minister Sohi, who granted will no longer be a part of this government for a long time, but is going back immediately to this sort of partisan rhetoric of blaming other people. It's certainly not going to appease people in Alberta who are quite angry and quite anxious and not at all reassured by this news.
We have a clip. Let's have a listen to what Premier Jason Kenney had to say earlier on the show when I asked him about his claim that there is a deliberate policy in play to shut down the oil sands.
Prime Minister Trudeau himself said he wants to phase out the oil sands, and much of the senior political staff in their government worked for organizations in the past that were explicitly committed to landlocking Canadian energy. So yes, I do think that it is ultimately their intention to, as to quote the Prime Minister, phase out the oil sands.
So, Liz, okay, I think I heard Nigan. I heard you react to that. What do you make of what? Or Marty? It was Marty. I would react to that. Marty,
well, I think sounded like a Marty scruff.
That was a Marty. Marty, can I get you to weigh in on, or what do you make of what Mr. Premier Kenney had to say there?
Stephen Harper intimated the exact same thing, and they're saying that the majority of the oil sands have to stay in the ground in order for Canada to make any sort of dent in its carbon emissions. Also, to say that Justin Trudeau, it's absurd that to say that Justin Trudeau has an active policy to landlock Alberta oil is a demonstrable lie. They're literally building or twinning a pipeline right now to get more of that oil to the coast. There's this break in logic with this guy. And if we can talk about Encana for a second, several business realities. Business goes where business is. Encana is more invested in natural gas than it is in oil sands. Encana has more active acreage in terms of fracking in the United States than it does in Canada. By moving to the United States, they have access, as Marie said, to that capital of the United States. They also go and they basically benefit from the very boom that is depressing demand for oil, for natural gas, for Canadian source natural gas right now. So the idea that they're doing this out of spite, out of anything else, it's a plain business decision. But you know, in politics, as in journalism, 3 is a trend. And as Marie said again, you know, Alberta, like Quebec, has this visceral attachment to its things, and Kenney's building a billy pulpit out of it. He's using that, and he's saying this absolute patently absurd stuff about the Trudeau government not wanting to landlock Alberta oil to mark political. Like, this guy it's patently absurd. It doesn't make any sense.
Kelly, jump in there. Jump in.
I just want to jump in. You know, of course, this Encana exit follows, we're talking tens of billions of dollars of major oil companies also leaving. Mm-hmm. And the Encana executive earlier this year did express concerns about being able to attract capital in Canada because of the regulatory environment here. I'm not saying we're getting the full picture of what's going on, but I'm saying there were concerns even earlier expressed about that. And, you know, I guess the question is, why can't you have a company headquartered in Calgary that does most of its business in the United States? That happens all the time. And I think there is a problem among investors in terms of looking at Canada right now that does need to be addressed. And going back to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, my argument, and I guess a widely held belief here, is you remember the federal government did not want to be owning the pipeline at this time. They thought they could quickly sell the pipeline in the summer of 2018.
That's right.
That did not happen. They would rather not be pipeline owners right now. And the belief here is that Kinder Morgan, the company that owned that pipeline, was ready to walk within days. The federal government had no choice but to buy it in order to hold up Canada's reputation as a place where international investments can take place. And that's
that exact thing, Kelly, that exact thing flies in the face of what Kenny's saying. Kenny is basically saying the exact opposite. He's saying Canada doesn't want this reputation to attract investment when it comes to the oil sands. That's patently absurd. They literally they're engendering that very reputation by by basically supplementing the pipeline to the coast.
I'll also point out, this is Nigan right here, I also point out one other really important thing to remember is that while there's this sort of feeling in Alberta that the entire country is set against them, the Mayor Nenshi said on election night, millions of dollars was put into Calgary, and that resulted in the loss of votes in Quebec. And so we can't forget that the Trudeau government tried very hard to be able to win favor in Calgary, and then at the end of the day, didn't get any support.
And I'm not saying all the critics of the Trudeau government are correct. I'm saying there is reason for concern about the investment climate in Canada.
Okay, and on that note,
As far as oil is concerned, yes, probably.
we can. There's so much
And
more.
other things, arguably. So.
There is so
Guys,
much.
let Katie control her show.
There is so much more to discuss about this clearly, and these conversations obviously need to continue.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.